And then you're here. Clay, I just thank you so much for that kind introduction. I don't think you could possibly have a better opening and closing to this conference. And I gotta say, you know, I'm talking about pornography as a public health issue. And your state, of course, led the charge with the resolution, and now this is happening in Canada's looking. I'll talk more about that states, or Minnesota is introducing it right now. But so my job here was to talk about what that really means and how we make that argument, how we do the natural, what are the essences of that, so that we can push back about those who say it's not, et cetera. But I gotta say, coming off from this morning, that just grounds us in a much bigger, more relevant, what is humanity? What are human beings? What is love? What does connection mean? Makes so much of the rest of this seem like, oh, okay. Because another workshop that I often do is how do we take back our sexuality in a pornified culture? Well, and most of my work is child sexual abuse, sexual exploitation, sexual violence, so it's often in a culture where this is so common. How do we take that back? And the ultimate within that word, of course, is how do we really reclaim and talk about love and intimacy? And of course, Clay has been key in championing getting people to really think about that, own that. And so I'm kind of going, I don't even want to talk about what I'm supposed to talk about, but it's still important too. Because a frustration I have as we do this is we know, as true as everything I just said was, and this morning was, to make the arguments to do the change, we are a system that is geared in, we have to have research and we have to have data. And we have to show what works and what the outcomes are. And the good news, compared to many years ago when we were trying to make these arguments, we didn't have that. We didn't have that in the same way. It's a very different time. So I am, in the short amount of time I have, I'm only going to really dance on some highlights of several slides that I'm going to go through. There is a handout, there's more, there's so much more information, so many speakers to give you more on that research. I just want you to literally taste what some of these tidbits are across the very important and relevant research and what it means to be a public health issue. And the reason I say issue, hazard, reality, you know, some people get in crisis, epidemic, we don't have to overstate that the validity that this is a valid public health issue, which makes it sound tame, but in the public health language, that's relevant. I want to thank you for being here. I want to thank you for the range of people that are here, for coming on a Saturday, for committing to going and talking about this more and doing this work, and I'm just delighted to be part of this impressive group. I always start with stories, and I want to just focus in on one. These are calls I get. I'm an individual private consultant, but I probably get 3 to 5 calls a week, so it's nothing like fight the new drug. But as an individual who just people find because they're so desperate. And one was a school system. I do a lot with problematic sexual behaviors in the schools. And they had a 5th grade boy who was repeatedly engaging in sexually harassing behaviors. So his behaviors went from problematic, something that tend to get minimized, not paid enough attention, to getting now to the line where it's going to be criminalized. And we tend to do that. We tend to criminalize children's behavior, which is a whole other policy issue challenge we need to pay attention to. And they finally started doing work. I do a lot of work in restorative or transformative justice. How do we do other ways of dealing with problematic behavior in a victim-centered approach that holds the person accountable but looks at the impact on the community and makes sense for outcomes? And as they dug into some of these backgrounds, I wasn't involved in this case. I was just getting calls in order to help a colleague at the Department of Ed that was dealing with it. One of the issues that became very clear is the essence of when this boy got into it. His parents were fighting. They were on the edge of a divorce, and he would escape to his room. And when he escaped to his room and he escaped to the internet, he was playing video games or he was finding porn. And it was a way to deal with all this pain, and then of course triggered all the different things we know that are the range of consequences and showed up completely in his behavior. But step back and take that picture and think of what it would have been if all we did is look at what a problem this boy was, and indeed what an offender he was. And his behavior had been very problematic on so many, but the solutions are key. And I always have a lot of different stories. When I wrote a play in 2014 after swearing off writing plays for 20 years, but this one was based on all survivors, adult survivors of sexual abuse and exploitation, men and women. Two of the women were different tribal leaders. This one activist, an Anishinaabe woman who is a survivor and writes a lot about her experiences in her home, all different kinds of violence, witnessing, experiencing, including being trafficked, and this was back in the 70s, and it being pornographically documented back then. She has been an activist and has talked for years about all the other abuses. Only recently, the documentation of the child sexual abuse, because that was the hardest, and to realize and deal with that reality that it's still out there. So individual stories are a huge part of what gets us here, about what connects us, about what moves us. But individual stories alone do not make this a public health issue. They matter a great deal to catching people's imaginations, to catching their hearts, to engaging them. But the reality is that the question we have to ask is not only why are there these different individuals, but why are there so many individuals? And however, the issue that makes this a public health issue, as this conference has dealt with for 15 or 20 years, for many years, is the change with the ease of access, the change of content makes this a public health issue. Depending on your age, we didn't grow up with this kind of content. By the way, this is an exercise class at a suburb where it was for moms to bring their daughters into a pole dancing class. And people couldn't even see anymore the problem that was, because we have come to accept so much of this. And the criticism some of us will get back, and we've heard a lot, is, oh yeah, but this is just cathartic, and blah, 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 blah. You're making this sound like the sky is falling. And I would say, as many have said in different ways, this is one of the first people I heard say it, a researcher who mostly looks at child pornography issues, is that this is one of the greatest unregulated social experiments ever. So we have a responsibility to be looking at the implications of what that is, because we don't fully know. We know a lot about effects, but we don't fully know them now. We have to understand the industry, and we know that groups like MindGeek own the majority of the free porn sites, and as Dr. Gail Dines, who I'm sure many of you have heard of or heard, says, that's like standing outside of a store and giving kids candy cigarettes. It is just the enticement, the come on in, one of the pieces of that. You know the stats. I'm not even going to go through those and read those about how big this industry is, but I put those up there, and I offer this to you in making a public health argument. The industry, what public health means as I spend more time on that, the size of it, the changing kind of piece that is, to say that understanding public health and the pornography industry helps to explain why we need systemic interventions and higher level leadership. We cannot do the arguments that you just need to make better choices. Parents, you need to do a better job of filtering and supervising. Wouldn't it be nice if we had a whole lot less to supervise and filter against? Like, what is creating this larger flow, not only, but including the individual choices? Because we know yesterday's porn is today's mainstream media. We know that the porn industry has tried very hard to be the main sex educator and to call itself just sex. And we know that there's a whole lot of research that shows a whole range of harm. And we know that many children and teens are learning more about sex and gender and relationships from that and other pornified mainstream media than from the caring and loving adults in their lives, and from actually evidence-based, accurate information. So that means, as adults, as leaders, we have a responsibility to fully understand what they're seeing and what we can do. Now, I'm on the board of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and have been for a long time. I do a lot with families of missing and murdered children. And one of the things that so often happens is the more we see the worst of the worst in cases, the more we want to criminalize it all. And the more we move in policy decisions towards criminal justice solutions. And there is a role for criminal justice solutions. But The public health frame would say, let's keep in mind, we can't arrest, prosecute, incarcerate, legislate, or even, for those of us who educate, this is hard, educate our way out of this. All important pieces. But the broader piece that public health embodies is that this is broad-based social change, taking on changing our environment, that we all have to breathe this toxic air. We all have to navigate through. We can't do that when we primarily invest on the other end of treating the people once they've been harmed or incarcerating them once they've broken the law. Those are pieces, but if we're all there, we stop really looking at what do we do to stop that flow in the first place, to make that change. Pornography itself has been defined as a public health issue since first documentation I see it. I'm going to be attending your presentation right after mine back there on public health as well. You might have a different piece of data. Was 1987. And Surgeon General Koop also addressed the then Surgeon General Koop and said basically for a problem to be a public health concern, it needs to be a social issue. When we define it as a social issue, it affects our society. Then from a public health perspective, that this affects so many individuals and groups, but it's beyond their capacity to make the change. Doesn't mean an individual can't make a difference. Doesn't mean an individual can't change their own selves, help their loved ones, help their families, demand change. But we've got to change our framework. And once it is that, then that's a responsibility that moves from individuals alone to holding external and social causes and influences accountable. That is public health. And George Elby said this very well in 1983. No mass disorder afflicting mankind has ever been brought under control or eliminated by attempts at treating the affected individual. Doesn't mean we don't do that, but we have to go and try to get there, not to just be more and more individuals who need that treatment. It is, public health is, what we do as individuals and what we do as a society to assure the conditions that people can be healthy, not only in our own relationships, families, and communities and organizations, but together, collectively. And this one, our Commissioner of Public Health talked about public health this way in Minnesota. I'm based in Minnesota, where it is 6 degrees. Thank you very much for having me today. That this helps me too, making the healthy choice the easy choice. And so when you step back and you put that frame on, it's not nearly as powerful and lovely as love and humanity and dignity, but it is another layer. It is what we're doing really making the healthy choice the easy choice? Or are you up against a wall and a pushback when you make a choice different than that? World Health Organization says public health is both an art and a science, which is true of prevention in general, and how we prevent the disease and prolong life and promote health through organized efforts. So this can feel like I am a parent of a 25-year-old and a 19-year-old, and having done child sexual abuse prevention work in the 70s and 80s and somewhat still, I know people would hear this stuff like they hear this now and you want to just put them in a bubble and take away everything, and that's not what it is. You know, same with this. But it is that when we recognize this as a public health issue, then that means we have to build a protective environment. This is an awe moment. This is my new puppy, Rose, who's now 7 months old, so older than this. But how many of you have ever had a dog and you go through puppy training? Anybody? What a foundational message. Control the environment, control the environment, control the environment. I heard it differently this time. I've done this before, but it's puppy training is an easy thing to do. Oh, yeah. Control the environment. And I thought that's so much like this. What do we do? What can we do as individuals? But what do we have to do collectively, especially given that this is such a sexually toxic environment, where a lot of the things that are harmful are appealing and draw us in. And that's because of the gender socialization, the frequency of abuse, exploitation, and violence, the hypersexualized images, and the lack of comprehensive, positive, information on healthy sexuality and relationships and love and intimacy and how we connect as human beings, and it all feeds demand. And in fact, our children have gone from Dr. Seuss to porn in terms of the images and the messages that they get. And pain and degrading the other person is too often depicted as sex. I have a booklet that I wrote in 2011 on the impact on children, youth, and culture that's been rewritten, but it's kind of stagnated at the other end. Hopefully it'll be up with a lot of the new research. But one of the things there we've been talking about for a long time is everybody's using the term normalization, but I want you to really know what that means. Normalization is when something goes from just being recognized as a problem and harmful, if not criminal, it's not okay, to just the way it is, no big deal. And in fact, when it's really normalized, the more insidious is it's just what people do. What's wrong with you that you're questioning it? What's your agenda? What are you trying to do? So it flips it, and it makes the questioner, the challenger, the problem. And as a trauma specialist, Dr. John Briere said, toxic decisions make sense in a toxic community. They seem rational. Why would this person risk so much? Toxic decisions make sense in a toxic environment. Why would a very good businessman or woman put those aside and profit from something so against even perhaps what they believe in? Toxic decisions seem rational in a toxic environment. Our children, in my field, we spend a lot of time on compliant victimization. And that means that's when a child is groomed not only by, in the term, it means when you're groomed by an individual, that you become compliant because the individual is so good at making you think it's your choice that then they blame you. We have become a lot of compliant victims in that we are groomed by the industry and the environment. And it grooms gendered in an overstated gendered way because it's males to see themselves as users and females to see them, and the demand, females to see themselves as a supply. Overstated, I know, but certainly part of that strategy. Public health. Do you remember, some of you remember, when tobacco, we finally had enough research to go up against the industry. This is happening with sugar again, it's a repeat performance and a lot of times. But you remember one of the things that really helped was it was a secondhand effect. So it's not just my individual choice, but it's that secondhand effect. And there was actually research a while ago, 2006, it was in Cambodia, but it was showing that with pornography there was a secondhand effect. Even if I protect my children from this completely, they are affected by the attitudes, expectations, and behaviors of kids who aren't. So there is a secondhand effect. Now, Center for Disease Control in the United States, sort of the bastion of public health, cites 10 different campaigns. I pulled up 5 of them, but these are things where we've really changed things that people didn't feel like were changeable. From immunizations and getting people to, how do you get people to do that? You don't just educate individuals. You have to put a lot of systems in place. Motor vehicle safety. I laughed at a person who collected older cars, my children's grandfather, and those older vintage cars didn't have car seats. And when they were little, they wouldn't even get in them without a car seat. When I was growing up, we didn't have car seats, and once we did, we didn't use them. So it's like, it's such a different frame. And now, of course, I wouldn't think of, it feels naked to not use a car seat. So it's a big change. Infectious disease, typhoid, fluoride in water, come back, we talk about tobacco a lot with this. Public health model, for those of you not familiar with that, and the CDC version language of that says, if we want to do this, we have to clearly define the problem. And interesting, just from hearing this morning, how you define the problem versus the harms, how we define the problem versus the research. How we even define pornography. Identify risks and protective factors. We do have much more research that help us do that now. But then we've got to develop and test the programs, the ones that work and are very effective. Then we want to say, we've got the data to show they're very effective, at least with this population and in this way, with this program efficacy. So we want to expand them, and we want to assure that widespread adoption of those. We want to make sure they're evidence-based. Now, definitions, I want to just say, first starting with porn culture, if you haven't seen Megan Johnson's YouTube, I just saw it, I don't think it's been out that long, but it is just such a good piece at saying we are outraged as a culture about sex trafficking, and we should be. But also as a culture in the United States, we have dealt with sex in terms of various psychological, physical, and relational consequences in a legal way, in terms of you can't force, or you can't molest a child, that sex that results in parenting. There's certain laws in place in practice with STIs. You need to notify partners, etc. But selling and buying sex is generally illegal unless that's filmed and distributed. Then it's culturally celebrated, encouraged, and in fact protected. What is going on in our thinking? And part of that is when you go to the language and you go to academic places and our academic debates. And I should tell you that I was trained initially in sexuality, and I was trained that porn is all good, and that as a therapist I should help people who had issues by showing them porn if people had trouble talking. So, I went from that to getting involved in sexual abuse and sexual violence and going, I learned a lot of good things, but I'm just questioning some of that core learning. And so we're up against people that have had this training, and so the legal sexually explicit materials intended for sexual arousal sounds like, what are we upset about, right? What's this sexually, and they want to keep it neutral, sexually explicit internet materials. Or the new one I've seen pushed back to ours is visual sexual stimuli. Now, what's all that say? Just sex. And in fact, if you're neutral, you define it as just sex. And yet we know the increasing violence, and we know that around the world, people don't say child pornography, they say child sexual abuse images because they recognize it, or materials, as documentation of a crime scene. They recognize the lack of the reality of it. So think of the difference if we said sexually exploitive materials, and that was our differentiation, and use that. But we're up against a challenge there. You know the research that says the majority of the content shows that there's violence, 88% of the scenes. We know that the number 1 or number 2 searched for type of pornography is teen pornography. Now, when you think of that, and you think of the commoditization of younger and younger and younger people as sexual commodities, that I get shaped to see myself that way, and that the most important thing I could possibly be is sexy, and desired in that way for only that thing, and see other people as those objects, it is an issue because we know, we can go on the computers right now, law enforcement can do this, you can see every computer that has child sexual abuse images on it. It lights up everywhere. Too many people to go out and arrest. We don't have those kind of resources. They are not all pedophiles, meaning sexually aroused to children. A lot of them are being shaped by looking at these images and then wanting something different, or shaped to see children as legitimate sexual commodities for them. And we respond in a criminal justice way alone for this because there is harm. So it creates all kinds of issues. Plus, as a child, if I'm gonna look at this and I'm 12, in some ways it makes more sense for me to look at a 12-year-old than an ancient 22-year-old. The not knowing that that's illegal content. And what if I'm at that age and I stay fixated on those images, which we're now seeing are a subset? I never grow out of that when I'm 42. And how do I respond just to even speaking up about that when that has become part of my sexual template? The pushback is natural. When we make progress, there is a pushback. So the fact that there's arguments coming out on this isn't a public health issue, it's not a public health concern, I thought, yep, okay, we're making progress. And of course, it's pseudoscience would be the arguments. We've got lots of science, that we've got lots of reasons to focus on the science of this and the research. This bunch of words is, it's in your handout, so you can dig into it. But one of the things I really tried to do is say, what are? We can say risk and protective factors. We know younger exposure, younger and younger age of exposure is one. We know the amount of time and frequency. We know the brain impact. We know that if I'm a youth at risk already with a lot of different kinds, with other trauma in my life, there's more risk. You know, so we can go on through these. We know something about protective factors in terms of, can I block more exposure? Can I limit that time? Get me to not even want to look at this at all, not have that. One of my friends talks about informed consent, and I like that concept. That means if I was really informed about what this was and about what it could do to me, would I still have that choice? Would I still, as a bystander, support other people's behaviors as much? Now, I have a neuroscientist in the room, so I'm going to really be conscious of this. But, you know, the simple form that the neuroscientists have helped us understand throughout the time is that, and the change with the brain research, I only take a little bit of time on this because other people are going to be doing that throughout here, but that, to me, if we can't get people on the basic human dignity, love factor, then, and we need our science to show it as a public health issue. There's a lot of science I care about, and a lot of us care about for our different reasons. But the impact on our brains, the developing brains, and the reality of the research is so important in that. We know that the neurons that fire together, wire together, whatever we do a lot of, we get good at. Playing violin, playing basketball, it actually shows up in my brain. So what I do a lot of, I get good at. It's in my brain. It's not that nudity, it's that click, click, click novelty. It is that the brain is malleable, that we have mirror cells. That means when I see something, I experience it as if I'm actually doing it. We know the supernormal stimulus research that I'm drawn to something bigger, brighter, shinier. That's just what's happening. There's a spike in dopamine and other feel-good chemicals. It's easy to get desensitized and habituated. I develop a craving for more, and that reward center gets weakened. And my brain gets cued into this in a different way than somebody that doesn't practice that all the time. And some of the best ways I've heard people describe that as our brake pads get worn down. One of my colleagues who does a lot with the adolescent brain development, not with this issue, but he always talks about how the adolescents are like a super sports car. We all were there. We all either are or were super sports cars with great capabilities. But the reality of our brain development with the prefrontal cortex still under development till the mid-20s means that we still have itty-bitty brakes. Works a lot of the time, sometimes they don't work. But what happens when we wear those pads down over time? So the impact on children, one of the earliest pieces I saw was a Canadian researcher who looked at non-clinical samples, and that was really key. And what she really found was that kids who saw pornography under age 10 particularly showed more questionable behavior, wanting to engage in more questionable behavior, were more aroused by violence, wanted more porn later in life. Great hook if I want to get you in there and get you younger. So, and it was viewed as sex ed. More recent study, 2014, really said when the age of first exposure to pornography is 11 years old or younger, and we've got that sexual sensation-seeking behaviors. I just want to sense something, I want to feel something, I want to experience something. That actually showed sexual risk-taking for both boys and girls. So that was one that showed us more of a link. Yarborough and other researchers with her work looked at 10 to 15-year-olds and said those that consumed this content were 6 times more likely than non-consumers to be engaged in sexually abusive behaviors. A later study of hers looking at 14 to 21-year-olds found that 1 in 10 reported some type of sexually abusive behavior in a relationship. Sit with that for a second, okay? Because I'm going through these because I want to get to the good things that are happening. But 9% of those, of that 9%, much greater exposure to, no big surprise, pornographic materials that shaped that thinking. And how here we are fighting to teach consent. And how lame that is against this massive education. Again, going to Michael Cito's research, he looked at juveniles who committed sex offenses and juveniles who committed other kinds of delinquent acts but not sex offenses. The difference in the groups, those that committed sex offenses, we just jumped over it, had more exposure early in life to sex and pornography, higher rates of sexual abuse, more atypical fantasies, which fit with that. People say we don't have good documentation of how much problematic behavior there is with our children because schools and youth-serving organizations, we don't pay attention until it's criminal, and then we have a lot of reasons to want to minimize that happened in our organizations. But we need to look at that so we understand it. Again, not in a criminalizing it, but the UK actually in their 3 communities they looked at showed an 80% rise in child-on-child sex offenses. And I would say problematic behavior where the child was the other person doing it. This meta-analysis, you've probably, those of you that do the research, those of you that don't, bear with me. There's a lot of meta-analysis, you're looking at a lot of different studies, you're saying, what do they say together? This was one of the first ones that instead of just saying there's a correlation, said, I don't know what happened. They don't want me to say anything else. I'm gonna go to my lifesaver there and see if you can help me on this. Said that there's actually a cause, that it really did show across 160 studies that we could say there was a causative relationship looking at pornography. And that was one of the first meta-analyses that said that, so a lot of course, debates around that, but I think a really important thing just to know that it's out there. I am so glad you are here for 150,000 different reasons. Okay, so they're saying, enough with the studies already! But you know, Girls and Sex, Peggy Orenstein's work, I think was important because she talked to 100 girls, and they talk about the need to compete with porn stars. How sad. How sad. How sad as a person who's fought to promote sexual health for so many years that we are back to that kind of place. We're back to saying, hearing girls say, I just got to learn to take it. I got to learn to take it. And boys with the best of hearts feeling like they've got to give it, do it, deaden their hearts and souls. This is like the dissociation that survivors of sexual abuse and exploitation speak of, that disconnect from their bodies, so that porn is part of that trauma. And for those of you who know adverse childhood experiences, huge important research that shows the immediate and long-term health consequences of early abuse. And the more types of abuse there are, the more adverse childhood experiences, the more the long-term health consequences. This, if we were to do that study now, I believe this exposure would be a source of trauma that would fit in that as well. This is going to be, can we focus while we're hearing cheers in the background? I'm not so sure. There's other great workshops looking at the effects on relationships, but in talking about, oh, this is really interesting. I do workshops on compassion fatigue and secondary trauma, and one of the things is, can we stay focused when there's chaos around us? So let's try and practice that. I'll try and pretend I'm not hearing voices and music and cheers, and you try that too. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but you can't, part of the public health argument is the impact on relationships, because we know a protective factor is caring and meaningful connections, human connections in a lot of different ways. And when this is about pixels instead of people and all the social anxieties that are coming up from this, and time on screens instead of time connected. You know, we've had somatosensory deprivation for a long time, deprivation of touch, because we equated all touch with sexual abuse, so we were afraid to touch. We used to equate it all with sex, so we were afraid to touch. And now we're connecting with technology instead of humans, and a lot more on the horizon to make that more likely, so it's not a surprise, despite the industry's arguments that this is a sexual aid and the defenders that we're seeing so much porn-induced erectile dysfunction at different ages. And another piece of this is going back to the compassion fatigue. I do that work on secondary trauma with investigators of child sexual abuse images, the people who have to look at that for their job. And you're now seeing video, you're hearing it, it's hard. It's hard. You can be highly trained, it's hard to look at that. And that's pretty well, so the Department of Justice really got in on that and said, we recognize the trauma of this. There's of the toxic exposure at the International and National Centers for Missing and Exploited Children, where they have to look at those cases. They have very intensive programs. We recognize that for highly trained professionals. And yet we defend it as an aid for our general public at all ages. Who's profiting from this loss? My sister-in-law's in advertising, and she kept saying, for years it took me before I paid attention, go after the money. Don't just think about educating everybody and getting everybody activists. Follow the money, follow the money. Who's profiting? Who's got an investment in keeping this going? And we know part of that challenge, and the National Center on Sexual Exploitation is doing a great job with mobilizing us around this. It's great and it's exciting, but it's hard to even track all of this. And with what's coming, with virtual reality and being in there and wearing these and sensing these bodies, there's going to be even less of a reason to have another human being as a person we're in contact with. And then people always say to me, the cat's out of the bag. Not in a way we can't do something about that cat. Not in a way. And the folks that help me a lot are at Prevention Institute in California, and Larry Cohn there, who really worked on all the early tobacco stuff. And he always says, you guys are so funny because everybody says, oh, tobacco was easy compared to whatever my issue was. But back then, he had companies, he created this spectrum of prevention when they were trying to do this, because so most of our prevention efforts focus in education. Individuals, training providers, educating providers, keeping the professionals educated. We need all that. But if 90% of our efforts to end this are just educating people about the problem and the harm, we're not building the coalitions, insisting on organizational practice changes and policy and legislative changes that are also needed with this. So we know that, going back to tobacco, he was offered a lot of money by the tobacco industry to stop his policy work, Larry Cohn, as long as and to do more education. They'd give him money to do education as long as he stopped the policy work. Think about that. They're all important, but how do we really mobilize? And for many of us, we can remember when there was smoking on planes, when there was smoking all the time in children's cartoons, when credible doctors were paid to say this was healthy because it helped with anxiety. The sugar industry is under this right now and getting caught for the whole issue of how research is used. Some of you might remember the Truth Campaign. Took a lot of the money from the lawsuits in the tobacco, with the tobacco cases where they did get the right to sue for harm, get that money and go into education. And they really tried to say, how do we just counter the lies that this is sexy, that this is healthy, that this is a great aid to all your anxieties. Tobacco and smoking is the answer to everything good. How do we counter those lies? And so they did a truth campaign. We need a truth campaign on this. We need a truth campaign that looks at love and intimacy and taking that back from the industry. They also did warning. I think it's time for warning labels. Warning labels or an informed consent or some level that we've got enough research, we've got enough data on a range of harms. Same with secondhand. I mean, some different areas of the world really do this in ways that are hard to ignore. The risk messages around tobacco, and we can talk about the good, bad, and indifferent of this type of messaging, but the idea that we would talk and help people understand secondhand effects. Policies, there's no one policy, there's no one resolution that's going to do everything. Gail Dines talks about it's like the Gulliver strategy. It's going to take a lot of little policies. It's going to take a lot of policies, a lot of actions. So yay here. Minnesota now is introducing a resolution of pornography as a public health issue. Other states have as well. I believe in the right to sue for harms afterwards. I mean, we've seen that relevant with child sexual abuse materials and in other areas. I think that we're also going to see, though, really other ways of how do we go after controlling this. Australia is working on a lot of grassroots efforts to put pressure on companies to make sure they put in digital filters and to focus on lawsuits. They're mobilizing from a grassroots level. Many of us are involved in Motion 47. Canada, the country, passed a resolution looking at pornography as a public health issue. But that was just to say, and I had a chance to testify there, and I was so impressed with how many of the members of Parliament actually came and listened to the whole sessions. This was pre the passing of it. But now they're studying it. Now the issue is going to be how big is the study, how serious is the study, and how serious are the recommendations after that. The UK looked at digital filters. It used to be called opt-in, opt-out. They didn't like that. They got a pushback. But I liked that concept. I liked the idea that if instead of having to block it and put filters on every bit of technology, it was automatically blocked. If I wanted it, if we're not at that place yet, if I wanted it, I could take down those filters. And if I had other people I wanted to filter against in my family, I would put those on. But to shift that up, they have one major company in the UK that still is doing that, and they have found differences, and they found it didn't hurt their business either. They're now well on their way towards age verification because of new technology. So you don't just say, oh yeah, I'm 18. And again, this is not the end-all and be-all because of everything we've heard today, but these are all different steps to try and help that ebb and flow. There was a study done that looked, Google and Microsoft took steps. Again, this is only with child sexual abuse images. And they really did more steps to block. And what they showed was a 67% decrease in the volume by taking those steps. Of course, adult pornography had none of that because there was no attempts to do that. So again, not an end-all, be-all, but it's one of them. Have any of you heard of Thorn Deterrence Project? Great group of technology people coming together to say, we want to get messages out to those that are searching for child sexual abuse images and see if we can't find effective messages when I'm searching that pop up that say, hey, did you know this was illegal? Did you know that this is really harming a child? If you're aroused by children, there are places that can help you. Get help. They've tested many different messages. They track who's going to what's working for what. They know there's not one message for everybody, so they need a lot of different messages. If they are seeking help, where they are going, they challenge the just looking mindset. Think about the possibility, if you will, of much broader partnerships with technology companies to not only, and of course we've got Clay Olson here, you'll hear from him at the end of the day, a brilliant example of using technology in so many different ways with Fight the New Drug and the Fortify programs, but there are many more partnerships we can go to use and think about how do we work this to have technology be a better part of the solution, not only for delivery of our programs and our treatment, but for really trying to deal with this flow. I think it's interesting that a while back in Quebec laws, they prevented commercials in children's programming to safeguard them around media. You'd think it would be good that we could at least stop sexually exploitive messages to those under 18. We should really be able to do it all the way around, but we can work with our advertisers to get them to agree not to do this. Over 15 years ago, the wine companies agreed to stop using women's bodies to sell their product. Beer companies didn't agree. And the images are quite different. So we need to, ads don't cause these issues, but they reflect and reinforce and shape dangerous beliefs and practices. I thought it was great, one of our men's active action groups actually went in one of our, it was in Duluth, Minnesota. They bought a bunch of alcohol. And they were buying it like a big party, like this was a big deal for this small, for this liquor company. But all around were very, very sexually toxic images of women, very degrading. And when they got up there, they went, oh my gosh, we should have looked first. You know, we're with the Men's Action Committee, and if we would have seen this, we only buy from people that don't reinforce sexual exploitation of women, and these advertising do. I'm so sorry we can't buy here. And walked out. You know, so one of the things when we protest and we don't buy something somewhere, we don't stay certain places, that's all great. But if they don't know why we're doing that and they're not hearing from it, they don't know. So it's like whatever it is. And what can be done, we use the research. There's so much more. These are just snippets of research in each of these areas. We need to identify the risk and protective factors. We also need to understand, and this is kind of mind-boggling that we don't, what is expected, we used to call it normative, sexual development in our children and youth. And if you look at just about any study, a lot of the things that are out there are pre the impact of internet and the pornography access. So many of the things they would say if a child is doing this, this, and this, or saying this, this, and this, they've likely been sexually abused because they wouldn't otherwise know that, aren't current. And think about how sad that is. Because that is a sexual exploitation of exposure, but we're not calling it that. But we need that research so we know what is expected, what is normative, so that we can see when there is harm and deviation. And we need the schools to be able to collect that information and other youth-serving organizations. And to have comprehensive curriculums that teach about relational health and engaging our businesses in very different ways, along with offering more supports for those who are harmed and recognizing trauma. We can build a movement. This is kind of silly standing here and doing it because you guys are like so far ahead of the game. In other places, it's not like that, where we get our diverse minds. We get people that don't work in this who care. We get people who are affected, who are willing to speak up and out, and those that love them, willing to speak up and out. It has taken us years with child sexual abuse and exploitation to realize we didn't do that. And yet if we all marched everybody who had ever been abused or exploited and everybody who ever knew and loved somebody who we would have massive numbers. And that is sadly true of those that have been harmed and affected in different ways from pornography. So we have a very large voice to pair with the movement of the range of professionals that are in this, the research that we have, and we focus on success. At the end of the day today, you'll hear from Dawn with the National Coalition on Sexual Exploitation to look at how easy they've made it for people to take action, to really, really help us reclaim and redefine the unacceptable. The summits, the trainings like this, their Dirty Dozen list. There are challenges, though. They've experienced this. There's challenge in every coalition I've ever worked in. We may not all share the same political or religious beliefs. But this is why the opening keynote was so critical. We share that caring about the human dignity, the power of love, the most important protective factor, research after research, the power of a caring connection, knowing how to have it, knowing how to maintain it, and having as many powerful, caring connections as possible. Sex can be forced, intimacy can't be. We need to learn a lot more about how to connect, and this is a barrier. So we can connect on issues we care about without getting blindsided, because those working against us would want to divide, would very much want to divide. So there you are, Clay, you'll have to do much more better later. But, boy, for engaging youth, for giving us a message we can get beyond, well beyond youth, fight the new drug. I'm very excited about engaging an effort to engage men. I'll come back to Don't Buy It. That is going by our Men as Peacemakers groups in Minnesota, but broad-based. Really looking at this crisscross between government, health, faith, and business leaders. Of course, parents and parents mobilizing for themselves and together, but really engaging those with lived experiences to speak their truth. The Don't Buy It project is just launched last month, so if you don't know it, look at www.don'tbuyitproject.org by Men as Peacemakers. So they have a series of groups, I can't remember if it's 12 or 16, where men come together with other men and they talk and they deal with the interconnections between the issues of pornography, sexual violence, sex trafficking, but more importantly, what it means to be male, what it means to connect, how they can be part of the solution. Very simple messages. Women are not products, people are not products. Men are more than consumers. Join the movement. Start by opening your eyes and seeing what we have been numb to. Don't buy it, whether that's a human being, whether that's the pornography, whether that's the products that support it, and become an effective ally and learn what that means to really be an ally, to stand beside people that are doing this work, to stand up and speak out. And they have a pledge, and there's mixed research on pledges and the effectiveness of that, but it's a good one in terms of crisscrossing all of the different things they want people to pledge to. I think that links to part of what a truth campaign is, that we need to start seeing the difference. And I'm not showing you the image here, but there are so many we could put there, that we can't even discern the difference between children, boys and girls, as kids, and them as very pornified commodities, whether that's the dance classes, the costumes, the toys. We do this to our adult female athletes. And all of these different, so many examples, but we have to see the difference because we've been numb to them. So the other thing is, if you don't, and in your handout I do have the link to Megan Johnson's The Porn Paradox. I think it's a very, very good piece. So I hope if you haven't seen that, you watch that. But really, as I first heard David Walsh say this, others have, whoever tells the story defines the culture. We cannot let the toxic media and the pornographers and those that defend them tell the story. We each can tell the story. We each can define this culture. Change is possible. To recover and to change, I could not keep doing this work if I didn't believe change was possible. In individuals and families and communities, in our culture, in our policies, in our practices, in our social norms. The power of hope. I love the theme of this. I love it, I love it, I love it. You know, my dear friend and colleague who just after 27 years of searching for her son, Jacob Wetterling, found out that he had been murdered the night he was abducted, sexually assaulted and murdered. So I was sitting in the courtroom with her and her family on September 6th, and Patty and the Wetterlings were known for hope. And at this time now where their son's remains have been found, and they found out the phenomenal brutality that he experienced at age 11, she still speaks to hope. The hope that there can be a different world for our children, for our adolescents, for all of us, that we can keep in mind the power of doing everything we can so we don't have so many people that have stuff to recover from, and to, with compassion, care about those that do to help them. Hope is action. And a revolution is what we are in, and a revolution is what we need, but that is a revolution with heart, based in our hearts. So, thank you.